There's something about the art of first edition Dungeons & Dragons that really captivates me. Perhaps it's because I have an affinity for old things in general. I think it's fascinating to look back at how things used to be and to experience the earlier iterations of something that I'm familiar with. I've never played first edition and I wasn't alive when it came out, but looking at some of this artwork, it almost makes me feel nostalgic for a game I never played and a period of time I never lived in. So whether it's for that reason or just because I think it looks cool, I really like OG D&D artwork. And in this video, I'm going to go through a bunch of original D&D books from the 70s and 80s, so I can highlight some of my favorite illustrations and share with you my appreciation for this aesthetic. We'll start appropriately enough with the very first piece of D&D media ever published, the 3-part box set for Dungeons & Dragons, rules for fantastic medieval wargames campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures, released in 1974 by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and featuring illustrations by Keenan Powell, Greg Bell, Cookie Corey, Dave Arneson, Tom Keogh, and David Sutherland. Some of these people were professional illustrators, but most were simply high school-aged amateurs or friends of the creators who happened to be half-decent at drawing, since, given that they were working with an incredibly low budget, Gygax and Arneson didn't have a lot of money to spend commissioning high-quality artwork. They dedicated a mere $100 of their budget to their artwork, and paid each illustrator only $2 to $3 per drawing. This according to the book Dungeons & Dragons Art and Arcana: A Visual History, which I highly recommend if you find any of this at all interesting. As one might expect, a lot of the pieces in the books are very crude, simplistic, and amateurish, but to me, that's actually part of their charm. I'm very often drawn to works of art that are made using limited means. I think it's the same reason I find things like pixel art or early 3D so interesting. The artists have to work around their limitations and restraints and try to make the most of it. A lot of these look like something some imaginative high school kid could have doodled while daydreaming their way through a boring class, escaping to a make-believe world of magic and adventure, which is very apt when we're talking about D&D, a game which is all about doing exactly that. Many of these pieces draw clear inspiration from pulp fantasy comic books, which also makes a lot of sense given the subject matter and the larger picture of nerddom at the time. Also, shout out to this depiction of an adventuring party that looks like something out of a Far Side comic. This was done by Tom Wham, and I think it's the only thing of his in this book, but he did do some other illustrations for later D&D books, and I really like his style. I think they do a great job of capturing the more humorous aspects of a gaming session. The first supplemental book for D&D, Greyhawk, contained fewer illustrations, all of which were done by Greg Bell. Particular ones I'd like to highlight are this Japanese ogre, the owl bear, this assortment of spooky bad guys, and the cover art, which has the first ever depiction of a beholder, which I think is really cool looking and kinda creepy. Moving on to the second supplement, Blackmoor, this book featured illustrations by Dave Sutherland, Mike Bell, and Tracy Lech. There's a number of illustrations in this book that I think really stand out and I'd like to highlight here. The art by this point is definitely more professional looking and less crude, I'd say, but it still retains that simplistic, slightly odd looking charm that I adore. My personal favorite illustrations here are the Umber Hulk and this Frogman who has just the best look on his face. The basic set was released in 1977. It was essentially a compilation of all the rule sets that had existed up to that point with some revisions and additions, and marks the point where Dungeons & Dragons was completely divorced from its origins in tabletop wargaming and unquestionably became its own thing. I really like the cover art here, done by Dave Sutherland. I think the dragon has a lot of personality to its design, and I just think the scene itself is very emblematic of D&D as a whole, and this era of the game specifically. The actual book itself is pretty light on illustrations, but there are a handful in there that I think are worth highlighting, which you're seeing right now. The first Monster Manual was also released in '77, and it is full of absolutely iconic illustrations. Done by David Sutherland again, David A. Trampier, Tom Wham, and Gene Wells. We see another interpretation of the Beholder, which ups both the goofiness and creepiness factor. A bugbear, who's very pissed off you caught him without his pants on. A lot of different dragons, all with unique looks to them. and a similarly diverse array of giants. The stone giant is definitely my favorite. I think this illustration of a kobold is pretty interesting and very different from the standard way they're depicted nowadays. Oh, and speaking of which, we need to talk about pig orcs, or porks. Yeah, it seems like there was a debate among artists in the 70s and 80s on how pig-like versus how human-like orc faces should be. Eventually, the less porcine, hulking green guys became the standard, and porks sadly fell into obscurity. Except for in Japan, interestingly enough, where Dragon Quest, which took heavy inspiration from early D&D, popularized the pig-faced look for orcs over there, where it can still be seen in Japanese media today. Maybe it's just me wanting to be a hipster, but I much prefer these early pig-face orcs compared to modern depictions that we see, and would love to see them make a comeback. This owl bear is interesting and kind of terrifying. Instead of having just an owl face on a bear, it's a giant owl beak as the entire face, basically. I don't know, I think I prefer the other version we looked at, but this is definitely very memorable. The Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook was released in 1979 and featured illustrations by David Sutherland and David A. Trampier. The cover art by Trampier I think is pretty good. It has a nice gloomy atmosphere to it, and I'm always a fan of a slightly goofy face like we see on this gargoyle-y statue thingy with gem eyes. I'm not a huge fan of this depiction of the different playable races. I think the proportions are a little funky looking. But other illustrations, like this full page of a paladin in hell, are absolutely beautiful. I like this big-headed, bald mage pondering an arcane tome surrounded by his otherworldly companions. And what could be more iconic than this picture of an adventuring party meeting in a tavern? The Fiend Folio was released in 1981 and featured a host of new monsters and other creatures for dungeon masters to use in their games, with illustrations by Chris Baker, Jeff D., Emmanuel, Albie Fiore, Alan Hunter, Russ Nicholson, Errol Otis, Jim Rossloff, David Sutherland, Bill Willingham, Polly Wilson, and Tony Yates. And right on the picture where it tells you this, there's an illustration of the best thing ever, so you know you're in for a good time. This book featured the debut of a lot of now iconic D&D creatures like the Aarakocra, Githyanki and Githzerai, the Drow, the Tabaxi, who look a lot less like cat people and just regular cats with a weird uncanny valley face, and the most iconic of all, Svenurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblurblur charming, amateurish quality we saw at the beginning is completely gone here, and these are just really great looking works of art. Newcomer Russ Nicholson, who, while doing research for this video, I found out sadly passed away this year, did a lot of the art here, and I really love his style. It has this really interesting kind of brittle feel to it. I don't know if that's the right word, but it reminds me a lot of something that Robert Crumb could have drawn. This scene of humans battling with Githyanki is absolutely fantastic. I don't even know what to say about it. The second Monster Manual, released in 1983, is the final book we're going to look at today. It featured illustrations by Jim Holloway, Jeff Easley, Harry Quinn, Dave Sutherland, and Larry Elmore. I think this table of contents image is pretty great. I strive to one day be as happy with life as this weird goblin thing. There's a lot of pretty good illustrations of just regular Earth animals. Not too exciting, but I think they're well done. You have some very nice looking demons and devils. My favorite is probably this orangutan-esque creature, but there are many others that I like a lot too. But my favorite illustrations in this book, and probably my favorite illustrations in all of D&D, are the Modrons. I love these boys. I mean, look at them. Do I even need to say anything? What is this guy seeing? What's he thinking about? So I've always loved Modrons, and I love the way that they're depicted in later editions of D&D. They're generally characterized by a combination of mechanical and organic elements, but here, you don't really see that. These creatures, to me, look entirely organic, which is contrasted with the unnaturally perfect polygonal shapes of their bodies. They're not so much a combination of machine and organic parts, but are rather machines made out of organic parts. And I think that's really cool. The Hierarch Modrons, basically the Modron gods, have a slightly different look to them. They remind me of the robot from Metropolis, which was famously the inspiration for C-3PO. I think they're cool, but nothing to me can rival the pure majesty that is the Quadrone. As the 1980s began to draw to a close and AD&D 2nd edition was released, you saw a notable shift in the art style. There's plenty of great stuff here as well, no doubt about it, and a lot of it is much more technically impressive than what we saw in 1st edition. But it is undoubtedly very different, and it does make me miss that unique vibe that the original art had. Before I end this video, I want to give a quick look through at some non-D&D art from the 70s and 80s that I consider to be of the same or a similar art style to what we've looked at today. I've been using footage in the background of the 80s D&D cartoon, which I certainly think uses this style to great effect. And speaking of cartoons, I think the 3 animated Tolkien films definitely have a similar look to them. For those who don't know the history, there was the Rankin Bass made-for-television adaptation of The Hobbit released in 1977, and then a year later in '78, Ralph Bakshi released his theatrical Lord of the Rings film, which had nothing to do with the Rankin Bass production. Rankin Bass then confusingly made a Return of the King adaptation, which is often confused for a sequel to Bakshi's film, but again, the two are unrelated. Regardless of that confusing history, I think all 3 of these films are definitely emblematic of this 70s and 80s fantasy style. I especially like the Rankin Bass version of Gollum. He's so different from how we picture Gollum today, but like with a lot of the early art of now iconic D&D creatures, that's part of the charm to me. Speaking of Ralph Bakshi, his other fantasy film Wizards also has a lot of really cool character designs and artwork. The setting is this really interesting blend of fairy tale fantasy and post-apocalyptic science fiction, which is really unique, even today. I don't want to say too much about Wizards, because for a second I was planning on making a whole video about it, and I may still do that at some point, but I will say I'm a big fan of this poster featuring the character Necron99 riding this weird chicken, camel, ostrich, donkey thing. Something else I really think gives strong early D&D vibes is Geetus. For those who don't know, in 2017, someone stumbled across this piece of artwork for a mysterious character named Geetus that no one knew the origin of, and for a while there it was this whole internet mystery lost media hunt thing. It was eventually determined to have come from this series of sticker sheets drawn by artist Sam Petrucci for the company Avery Dennison in the early 1980s. The style and character designs definitely feel very reminiscent of original D&D art to me, and I like them a lot. Someone put Geetus in your next campaign, please. By the time video games got sophisticated enough to depict detailed artwork, this style had already kind of fallen off. I mentioned Dragon Quest before, and you can certainly see an influence there as well as in many of the other Japanese RPGs that were inspired by Dragon Quest. But I would say this is more elements of the D&D style and subject matter reinterpreted in an 80s manga style, which is cool and interesting in its own right, but is definitely a different thing. As I was trying to come up with any example, I actually realized that the Zelda CDI games sort of fit the bill. These are definitely not good examples of this art style, but I do think you can see the influence, even if it wasn't executed very well. I'm sure there are many more examples of similar works that I'm ignorant of, so if you're watching this and the art in this video reminded you of anything else, please let me know, as I really like this art style and would like to see more things that look like it. But regardless, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I certainly enjoyed making it, as I think it's important to remember all of these artists who created unique and memorable illustrations that inspired generations and helped bring fantastical worlds to life.
Anyone want to play Dungeons and Dragons for the next quadrillion years?
Sure,
Yes,
I
please.
guess.
On to Rook 8.
I'm a 10th level vice president.